You know, when I was thinking about this morning's sermon, I was trying to decide if I was going to tell you guys this story because it's one of those stories that I don't want other people to know about me because, to be honest with you, I don't look great in this story. It's a moment where I buckled to peer pressure in the crowd. I grew up in a neighborhood that was not particularly well off, but we had a lot of kids, a lot of families in the neighborhood, and so there were 3 boys and there were 3 girls there, 4 girls in the neighborhood, and we sort of played together, sort of. And so the girls weren't really around this particular day, and the boys were all standing around, I don't know, playing kick the can or something like that, but up to no good, generally speaking. And one of the girls came home, and she was very excited. And so she came up to us. We were all standing in a group, and we said, "Where were you?" And she said, "My dad just took me shopping." And to understand really the story, you need to understand a little bit about her dad. He was about as dumpster fire of a human being as you can imagine. And he was a raging alcoholic, beating his wife and his children all the time. All the neighbors could hear him destroying the house, destroying them. And his decisions in his life had really done quite a bit of trauma. And so when she came home and said, "My dad took me shopping," we were all like, "Whoa, okay." And we said, "Well, what did you get? What did he get you?" And she said, "He bought me new shoes." And she was so excited because it was so out of character for him. And she said, "Do you like them?" And the 3 boys were standing around, looked at these shoes, and the one boy said, "Those are pretty. Pretty ugly." And then we all laughed at her. And she ran into the house crying. And I don't remember a lot from my childhood, but I remember that feeling of disgust with myself. I didn't do anything but just go along with the crowd. I had taken something special and sacred to her, and in a moment of vulnerability, I and my friends had turned it into a subject of derision and mockery. I didn't have the courage to stand up for her, but not only that, I joined in the laughter and the mockery. In our passage today, we have another group of people who are going to do some despicable things because of their fear of the crowd and the fear of what others would think. If you would, open up your Bibles to Mark 15, chapter 15, 1 through 20. Would you stand in honor of God's word as we read our passage? As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer. So Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they had asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder and insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you called the King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him!" And Pilate said to him, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released to them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. And then they led him out to crucify him. You may be seated. Courage is a rare virtue in our time and age. I have the feeling, though, that courage has also always been a rare virtue. And we can see here that courage was a rare virtue in Jesus' day. In the Marine Corps, the core values of the Marine Corps are honor, courage, commitment. And so we would have to say these words over and over and over again. And if you were punished, when you did push-ups, you said honor, courage, commitment, 1. Now for you, those of you who are counting, that is not 1, that's 2. And so this word was drilled into our head, courage. And it has several different meanings, but this is the one that they gave me. Courage is more than bravery in battle, but it is doing what's right even when it's unpopular or costly. Courage is more than bravery in battle. It's doing right even when it's unpopular or costly. Each person in this passage fails in weakness, and Jesus bears the cost for them all. If we're honest, every single one of us has been there, where our weakness led to failure and where courage was laid aside so that we could assimilate into the crowd and go unnoticed. Not one person, but every person in this passage fails the test. Pilate fails. The Jewish leaders fail. The crowd and the soldiers fail. And into all that failure steps Jesus. The weakness starts with Pilate. And it is a weakness of false peace. If you recall last week, our story began in the Sanhedrin, where they had already made their decision, and they were trying to drum up facts to fill their narrative. And now that they have drawn their conclusions, they have handed him over to Rome to carry out their condemnation. Because, you see, while the Sanhedrin had moral authority, they do not have the authority to carry out corporal punishment. Only Rome could execute someone. So the leaders took Jesus to Rome. And Jesus is brought before Pilate early in the morning. And Rome, of course, doesn't care about Jewish religious disputes. A charge of blasphemy in Roman culture would be no reason to put a man to death, and so it means nothing to Pilate. And so therefore they have to change the actual charge. If you recall, the charge from the Jewish side was that Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah, and he was claiming that the Messiah was God. Do you remember that? It was a charge that they had never even imagined could be possible. It was so awful that they tore their robes when they heard it. So they had to change the charge to something Rome would care about, namely treason. And that's why Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And now it becomes political. It becomes dangerous. If Jesus claims to be a king, he is a threat to Caesar. Of course, I don't know about you, but whenever I heard about this story, I kind of had this feeling like Pilate is just a little bit of an innocent victim, that he's just put in a bad situation where he's got to make a hard choice. Not really the case. Pilate is kind of a bad guy. Even by Roman governor standards, he's a bad guy. According to Roman historians Philo and Josephus, Pilate is violent and heavy-handed. Philo, who is also a Roman, and a pro-Roman historian, wrote of Pontius Pilate, he's inflexible, merciless, and prone to corruption. And while he often brought strong brutality to knock down revolts, his fear of losing power made him weak and unwilling to stand for justice when he believed it would cost him something. And so Pilate questions him. And Jesus answers briefly, but for the most part he remains silent. But what Jesus does say to Pilate when the accusation of being the king of the Jews comes forward, he responds, "You have said so." Not exactly a denial, is it? It's controlled. It's a deliberate answer. Jesus is saying to Pilate, you are saying something true, but you do not understand what you are saying. Pilate is thinking in terms of political power and threats, but Jesus is speaking of a kingdom that Pilate cannot see, cannot perceive. And from this point forward, Jesus goes silent. Mark tells us he made no further answers. And this was sort of astounding to Pilate because Pilate was used to people begging for their lives, giving reasons for why what was being said was not true. But that silence is not weakness. That silence is purpose. This scene should bring to mind for us Isaiah 53:7. It says, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth." Jesus is not trying to escape the moment. Listen to me. Jesus is not trying to escape the moment. Jesus is not trying to escape the torture. Jesus is not trying to escape the mockery. Jesus is not trying to escape the cross. He's embracing it. Jesus says just enough to declare who he is and then remains silent so he can do what he came to do. Pilate is shocked by his silence. He doesn't argue his way out of the cross because he came for the very purpose to die on that cross. Mark tells us that Pilate knew that it was out of envy that they had brought him to him. And so he asks the question, what evil has he done? But Pilate is just putting on airs. He's not confused. He's convinced. He knows that Jesus is innocent. He knows that this is unjust. And yet, he does nothing. Why? because Pilate is ultimately not concerned with justice. He is concerned with peace, but not real peace. It is a false peace. It is the kind of peace that avoids conflict to protect position, to keep the crowd under control. So he asks, what shall I do with Jesus? Instead of acting on truth, he defers to the crowd. Can you imagine a judge in our society today going through a case and then looking at the crowd and being like, I don't know, what do you guys think? It would be utterly absurd, and it was absurd in that day. Pilate is the Roman prefect. He's in charge of all of Judea, and yet he asks a mob what he should do. This is not leadership, it's cowardice disguised as peace. If your type of peace requires that you ignore justice, it isn't peace, it's compromise. Pilate has authority, but he has no backbone. He has clarity, but no courage. He fails in weakness, and it costs. And here the cost is justice. Several years ago, I went on a trip. This is when we lived in Ukraine, and I had to go to Krakow to renew my visa. And so while I was in Krakow renewing my visa, I had a couple days while they do the documents and such. And so I thought, I'll do some tours. And so I went, I had planned a tour to go to Auschwitz. Just say it really fast. And it was a bit of a mistake because I prepaid for the tour, which was going to be later in the day. And so while I was waiting for that, I decided to go to the main square. Now, if you go to Krakow, by the way, Krakow, my favorite city in all of Europe. So if you get a chance to ever go to Krakow, go to Krakow. It's awesome. But I was in the main square of the city, and there are people walking around with signs that say free tour. And so I was like, sweet, free tour. And I asked the lady, what is this tour for? And she said, well, it's a tour of the Jewish quarter, and it comes with a free lunch. And I was like, score. And so I decided to go on the tour. Well, what I didn't know about Krakow is that Krakow was where the ghettos were started. And what they did, about half the city was Jewish, and so they pushed all of the Jews into a small section of town, and then they put a wall around it with barbed wire to keep them in. And when that became unmanageable, then what they did was they took Jews out and they put them on train cars, and they shut the train cars up, and then they drove them to Auschwitz. That's wrong, I know it, but Auschwitz. There you go. Thank you, sir. So they just saw me up here just struggling like a man drowning, right? Threw me a life raft. So they would put them on the train, and then they would exterminate them in a very calculated way. And as she was explaining to me what had happened, it was amazing to see how many polls chose silence over truth. Not all of them were perpetrators, of course, but many chose to, quote unquote, keep the peace by not speaking, not resisting, not intervening, and that false peace allowed evil to flourish. Now we can look at that and say, well, if I was there, I would have done the heroic thing. I would have hidden the Jews. But let's talk about today, in our time. It shows up when we stay silent in a conversation because we don't want to cause tension. When we avoid saying what is true because it might cost us a relationship. when we choose to be liked over being faithful. We have to ask ourselves, friends, where am I choosing false peace instead of truth? Where am I avoiding conflict, not because it is wise, but because conflict would cost me too much? It's usually not wisdom. It's usually weakness. But Pilate is not alone in how easily he is swayed, but the crowd is also easily stirred up. There was a custom at that time to release a prisoner at the feast, and Pilate offers them a choice, Jesus or Barabbas. Now, just to be clear, Barabbas is also not an innocent dude. Oh, he is terribly guilty. He is a murderous insurrectionist. But he's a fan favorite, which boggles the mind. Why? Mark tells us the chief priests stirred up the crowd. Crowd mentality and crowd control always has sort of fascinated me. You see these videos of TV weirdo preachers waving their jacket and the whole crowd falls over. Am I the only one that's seen these? No? Okay. It's amazing how easily we are influenced, shaped, and manipulated. Only a week earlier, these same people were shouting, "Hosanna, Hosanna," and waving palm branches. And now they shout, "Crucify, crucify." Even Pilate asked them, I imagine in a shocked way, why? What evil has he done? The importance of knowing what you believe. A crowd without conviction will always be controlled by someone else's agenda. A crowd without conviction will always be controlled by someone else's agenda. And here, the cost of truth is being shouted down by an uproarious mob. The culture of the crowd is really no different in our day. Isn't it amazing how we as a society can turn from admiring someone, perhaps a business leader or a pastor or an actor or a politician, to disgust with them? If done skillfully, we as an audience, we as a crowd, don't even notice how we've shifted. And so it becomes even more important to consider what voices are shaping how I see Jesus. What voices are shaping how you see Jesus? When you're following the crowd, truth no longer matters. Volume does. And when volume wins, truth gets buried. A crowd without conviction is always controlled by someone else's agenda. If your convictions are shaped by the crowd, they were never really convictions in the first place. I'm often reminded of this when we see various protesters, and some of the funniest videos are when they go and ask the protesters about the very thing they're protesting, and they haven't got a clue. They haven't got a clue. If you are feeding yourself on truth, on the words of God, then someone else can't feed you. But if you are not feeding yourself on truth and the Word of God, then someone else is feeding you lies to fit their agenda. We follow the crowd when we adopt what everyone else believes without testing it. Test it. Test it. We follow the crowd when culture shapes our thinking more than Scripture. We follow the crowd when we stay silent because we don't want to stand alone. And this passage reveals, though, a problem that is not simply a Jewish problem. It's not simply a Roman problem. It's a human problem. The weakness of all of us problem. And that weakness falls on Christ. The leaders have made their claims now. Pilate has folded under the pressure, and the crowd has shouted down the truth, and the painful results are to follow. But before the crucifixion will come, the scourging ensues. Jesus is led away to the courtyard for a beating that was so brutal that most prisoners never made it to the cross. The Jews had a law that limited the beatings to 39 lashes, but the Romans had no such restraint. Jesus was not beaten under mercy. Pilate hands him over to a system that has no restraint, no mercy, and no justice. And Jesus absorbs it all. The prominent tool of the trade was called the flagellum, sometimes referred to as a scorpio, the Greek word or the Latin word for scorpion, for its sting. It was a leather whip with tips that were embedded with pieces of bone and lead and iron balls, sure to bruise and to tear the skin and flesh off of its victim. The intent was to rip the flesh off so that the muscles and the bones would be exposed to the element, leaving bloody stripes across its intended victim. Again and again and again he was hit. No resistance, no retaliation, no defense. The soldiers mock what they do not understand. They yell, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They wrap him in purple, a color traditionally worn by royalty, and they fashion a crown out of thorns, which is beaten into his head to drive the thorns deep into the flesh. Every lash he receives, though, every smack of the metal against his skin, tearing it off of his ribs over and over and over again, is not for his sin. It's for mine. It's for my sin. It's for your sin. For our sin. Isaiah 53:5 starts having real weight at this moment. It says, "But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds, we are healed." The power of the scene comes not from the soldiers, not from Rome, not from the Sanhedrin, but from a substitution. The injustice, the humiliation, the mockery, the beating, all of it belongs to me. And yet he receives it. He receives it. I deserve the beating. I deserve the lashes. Because I know what's right, and yet I do not do it. But I don't get it. He receives it. And if you want to see what that means, look at Barabbas. He is the last character that we have yet to talk about. Barabbas is a murderous insurrectionist deserving the full weight of his punishment. He is guilty. And in the midst of all the chaos, I wonder how he felt. I wonder if he witnessed Jesus taking his place, watching the whip crack down on him as he's tied to a post over and over and over again, hearing his screams and realizing, that's mine. That's my punishment. So let's be honest. All of us have been Pilate, knowing the truth and avoiding it. We actually have also all been in the crowd, going along with whatever is the loudest instead of what's right. And we are all, I am, Barabbas. Guilty. And yet standing free. The only reason the guilty walk free, the only reason I walk free, is because Jesus did not. He takes the place of the coward. He takes the place of the compromised. He takes the place of the condemned. And he walks. He walks to a cross. A few years ago, a song came out that I judged captured this great exchange, this substitutionary sacrifice on my behalf. The song is titled, I Am Barabbas by Josiah Queen. And earlier this week we were talking about this passage, and I was thinking about this idea that I am Barabbas. And so I asked Christina to learn it and play it for you guys. And it captures the tragedy well as the beauty of this moment. Here's the point. Barabbas gets life because Jesus gets his cross. I get life. You get life. Because Jesus gets my cross. He gets my beating. He gets my punishment. I get life.
They said this preacher man comes from Galilee, did something so absurd that he deserved to serve my penalty. How can it be? I know I've done my wrongs, 'cause doing wrong is something I do well. I know the court of law, something like this doesn't ring a bell. How can it be? Sit right there as I watch them beat that preacher man. 39 of all them lashes should have been on my own skin. How can it be? How said,